And there always is this existential uncertainty, right? Like you talked about being in Germany and the possibility of World War III. For me, I grew up in mainland China until I was 18. So when the Tiananmen massacre happened, instantaneously, my outlook on life changed, right? So when I visited the Berlin Wall in 2003, it was a very emotional time for me as well, just to sense into really what is humanity built out to be, right? When the Berlin Wall fell down in the West, in the East, it became fundamentally unsafe. Yet we are talking about how to become indigenous again. And I can see like children are just indigenous to this world. They're indigenous to nature. They know how it is to be. It is such joy to exercise every one of their capacities, and it's limitless. And that's how nature knows itself, is through every being growing to be, right? So can you speak a little bit more to what indigenous means to you? I also want to bring in the part about what so-called primitive cultures, right? So I do have a Native American practice that's why this, right? The 4 directions and the rituals that come with it. And when I first came to these practices, I was amazed at how they were in the sort of very human sense, because there's alcoholism in their communities. Their grandkids are in and out of the prison systems. Yet when they are conducting these ceremonies, there's nothing but joy. And so you talked about resilience and a new narrative. So indeed, they have lived through these traumas, right? Every single one of them in the Native American communities. Yet they do have a narrative, a narrative that brings down so much hope. This idea of all my relations, right? Like everything existing, we are participants with. We're in relationship with them as if we are their children and they are our children. So this idea of being indigenous also seems to me to be part and parcel of having this, some ways, hopeful narrative, or maybe just a natural narrative of the energy of life itself. So well, I would love for you to speak a little bit more to what the indigenous mean to you.
I mean, first of all, of course, that's always like, particularly in the American current context, being overeducated, white, middle class with a German passport, I'm not necessarily the right democratic group to be presumptuous about speaking about indigeneity. But maybe precisely because of that, like I found myself in this bizarre situation that Rona Fabienne, who's the editor of Cosmos Journal, asked me last year to write the keynote piece for their summer edition, which was on returning to Earth wisdom. And it was one of those emails, and since I love her work and love the journal, I just said, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And I responded, I'll write it on Indigenous to Life, Coming Home to Place. I just gave it a title and then put it in my diary for 4 weeks later, spend a day writing this article and send it to her. And when I got to that day and realized what task I'd set myself, I was a bit, how do I say something meaningful there? And really, what pains me precisely because, I mean, the indigenous cultures we observe today, most of them, almost all of them, have been affected by 500 years or less or more of colonial oppression and of forced re-education into the way of seeing that we were just discussing earlier, that is part of the crisis. And since we're all human beings, it is likely that also in those cultures, there are 0.5 to 2% of people that are sociopathic or narcissist or psychopathic. and love demagoguery and love the soapbox of populism to create an indigenous that is radically in opposition to what is not indigenous. And I think if we make that mistake, no, I would venture to believe, and I'm standing to be corrected by others, but I think there are few indigenous elders in any of the world's traditions who would actually go against the statement, we are all indigenous to life. And just the fact that my culture was attempted to be colonized by the Romans 1,500 years ago, and they told the Romans to go home in the Teutoburger Wald, was also part of and eventually they did come, and eventually that culture did oppress the power of the Druids and the nature-based wisdom that was in those lands just as much. And what got burned at the stake in the form of more women than men was the ancient wisdom of participatory engagement as landscape with landscape. So we've had our own colonialization and our own driving out of indigeneity. And I have met wonderful Sami people in the north of Sweden who still very much demonstrate that there is a alive European indigenous culture. And the same is true, not quite to that extent, because much more colonized, but in Scotland and Ireland, you can still find access points to an indigenous way of being. And in probably most places, if you spend long enough. So for me, this two ways, like we already spoke about this, to not speak about regenerative cultures as a utopia in the future, but as our birthright, and as the pattern through which human beings and their cultures and communities fit into the regenerative patterns of life itself. And so it's a double anchor. It's saying we're not a cancer on the planet. We have it in ourselves to be regenerative. And it's saying we're indigenous. We have a higher ground to meet as all peoples that is beyond the very, very dangerous dogma of the nation state. That is a new invention and is really not working for us. And if we find that higher ground in our common indigeneity to life itself, and we understand that regeneration, creativity or evolution and destruction are part of the cycle with which life creates novelty. As Goethe said, death is life's ingenious way to create plenty of life. Apply that to the die-off of the human species, and it's still dangerous ground, like social Darwinism, blah, blah, blah. Don't want any of that. But at the same time, if we find the higher ground to so deeply identify with life again, that we understand that the best we could ever do is become regenerative expressions of the places we inhabit. And that we have blueprints on how to do that. And that in the process, there will be eventually less of us, maybe could be less traumatic than we think it needs to be. If we go the war and power over and final fight for resources space. I mean, even like a very sensitive link from this indigenous conversation and being indigenous to life to the dialogues of the COP system in the UN, is that green mirage that Dennis Meadows says is impossible. That's being built on resources that are currently underneath indigenous managed lands, which are the biodiversity hotspots of the planet. Meaning, in clear speech, if we get at those resources, we've had it. Because the last reserves of biodiversity of life being healthy are in those places where indigenous people have carefully been custodians of those places for generations, despite the fact of 500 years of colonialism. And so there's a wonderful TED talk by my friend Olivia Lazard that is really worth watching, where she speaks about the blind spot of the green energy transition. And in that, she makes it very clear that there's not just a resource issue, like that if we build that green tech future, we need to mine more and extract more and process more for the next 3 decades rather than less. And half of what we need to mine is under indigenous owned biodiversity hotspots, and the other half is in politically sensitive places. And the Chinese government has cornered the processing capacity of these rare earths. So it's a geopolitical game too. If we want that future, it will be the Chinese future. So we're a bit between a rock and a hard place, and it sounds maybe a little bit too simplistic, but sometimes I think maybe a little bit of collapse will make it easier on us to be more place-based and focus on healing our bioregion, because we will realize that building another aircraft carrier to start muscling up to the United States is definitely a road of no return for humanity.
Yes, living between a rock and a hard place is we're here for, and in this particular karmic time, right? So the idea of the rites of passage, you talked about basically a species level rite of passage, right? So in this particular juncture of being in this process of collapse, as you said, for the last 50 years, what do you envision as rites of passage that can be collective as well as individual, that shift the thinking, that make us realize that we're not actually separate?
I mean, I think it's the planetary situation itself. It's life itself being now in danger through the actions of one in its midst that will force the rite of passage of realizing that we are participants in this process and our actions matter, and they kill us and other life forms. And they can also, but the paradox is that we've always been the disruptor in the system. So if we learn, I mean, the agriculturalist is nodding, if we learn how to disrupt wisely, we can create more abundant systems, more diverse systems, more flourishing of life as life. But we need to know when and how and at what pace and in what rhythm. And it's that what I think we need to relearn somehow. How do we fit in? How do we get out of our own way with all our mental ideas enough that we let life's regenerative force flow through us, because we actually believe that we're capable of doing it. And also this notion of AI and data and big data and all of that, it's so one-sided that it's not really putting into foreground the possibility that if we truly live in a participatory relational world where the relationship between all what shows up as manifestations of that world stores information of how they came about to be in that way they are right now and how they will transform into the future, then we're talking about natural intelligence distributed in the entire system that is a living planet evolving. And we're beginning to see that what we call AI is Kitty Hawk, but of course it is capable of destroying us if we don't realize how nature will always be so much like that. The modern human nature, it's this paradox again that even technology has to be understood as part of nature if you want to understand nature correctly. But that doesn't mean that every technology is positively adaptive and will contribute to the continued evolution of humanity. Most technologies will end up in existential threats to ourselves. And so how do we, like, I think in this shifting the worldview back into participation, back into place, back into specificity of community, into healing our bioregion, into slowing down like Claudius is doing in the Alpujarra with living off the grid, that process will actually, that deceleration can teach us again how dependent we are to our local food supply and how it's wise to not just get a veg box, but do a community-supported agriculture system and share the risk of farming with your local farmer. So you know that if there's a crisis, you're in it together, both in the days of gluts and the days of famine. And it's those human relationships, I think, that we've not really paid enough attention to. And to come back to your question, there are ancient technologies, simple technologies, the way of counsel, sitting in a circle with a talking stick, speaking from the heart, listening from the heart, keeping it to the essence, and being spontaneous. 4 basic invitations that make a level of communication possible that allows us to experience our own access to collective intelligence. Mm-hmm. And our own nestedness in a long line of the future generations represented in the fire before us, and the ancestors behind our left and the right shoulder, being co-present in that future potential of the present moment. It's not about, we're here in council to decide what we're going to do tomorrow and create the action plan and the blueprint and the 2030 strategy. No. It's the council itself that has the agency to make everybody understand to how to participate more wisely the next day in that moment. And so those technologies, I think we need to understand that they're sacred technologies that have helped indigenous regenerative place-sourced cultures for most of our human history. And when you come into that rebellious, full of hormones, transformational age of teenagedom, going out into the wild for 4 days and 4 nights and doing a fast, being held in a community of elders and like-minded, can create an experience that really matures a person and changes how they see their parents, how they see their community, how they participate with their peers. And I think so all these kind of, I mean, in your neck of the woods, you might have come across the School of Lost Borders in California. They're doing really wonderful work. I trained with them in both the way of counsel, nature of counsel, and did a vision fast with them. And I think that there are now more and more places all over the world that are taking this into different cultural contexts. We have counsel in prisons and in boardrooms and in schools. It's dropping the bullying rate like this. So I think these sacred technologies of rite of passage are actually already coming back.
Indeed, and plant medicine also as a spiritual technology is becoming mainstream.
You know, Paul Stamets right next door, so he's a good friend of mine in Olympia, Washington. I think, yeah, the whole taboo on plant medicine and but again, of course, in good California way, we then make a hype out of it, and everybody goes and does ayahuasca. But these sacred technologies and sacred plants have been with humanity for the beginning of times, and it is entirely possible, as Paul suggests, that our frontal cortex even started to evolve the way it did because we ingested some of these substances. And that doesn't mean that it's going to help everybody to just go out and, like, without the right scene, setting, and context, experiment with these things. So, yeah, how did we get there? Rites of passage, absolutely. It makes perfect sense.